For more on the growing economic impact of coronavirus, let's welcome Ian Bremmer. He's Eurasia Group founder and president. His piece on the coronavirus was featured on the cover of the February 16th issue of Time magazine. And Ian, thanks for joining us.
Always good to be here.
A lot's changed even since you wrote that cover piece. This is changing on a day-by-day basis right now. I know there's still a lot we don't know, but what's your best understanding of where we think this might play out and what it means for the global economy?
Two scenarios, right? One is like SARS 2.0, where you have this V-shaped hit and it rebounds really quickly. Second is that we get outbreaks that go beyond China, and it has a much more significant impact both on the Chinese economy but also globally. Either way, you have this happening in the context of a Chinese economy where a lot of American manufacturers, service providers have been saying for a long time that their footprint on the ground in China is actually bigger than it needs to be, right? I mean, labor costs have only gotten higher. U.S.-China relations, the competitive environment in China is more challenging for them. You've got an American government that really wants them to have stories about how you're coming back to the U.S. They didn't really want to make big changes because they were making money and they didn't want to upset the Chinese government. Right. But in this context, you're giving an awful lot of people an excuse to rationalize that supply chain. And I think that's something we will see as a knock-on over the coming months.
The supply chain already has spread to places like Vietnam. Do you see more manufacturing actually coming back to the United States?
I think that there's going to be more to the United States. Vietnam definitely has increased its economic capacity, but huge labor shortages there. The infrastructure isn't what it needs to be to tolerate a significant amount of cross-investment coming in from China, and also the capabilities on the ground aren't what they need to be. So there was movement inside China going from big cities into the interior, into smaller, less competitive cities where labor costs were low. Now I think you're talking more about insourcing. In other words, trying to be on the ground where more of your customers actually are. So you service China out of China, but you service the United States more out of the United States. And again, before coronavirus, my presumption is that would have waited until the next major economic down cycle. I think for China specifically, this now is going to be a reaction that's shorter term.
Well, let's talk about what's happening with the Chinese economy. Again, we're monitoring this on a day-by-day basis. But you've got already places like Morgan Stanley saying you're going to see much lower first quarter growth. Jim Cramer has said as low as 1% to 2% in the first quarter. And S&P came out yesterday and now say they're looking for something, I think, like 4.4% for GDP for the full year. It's the second largest economy in the world. How does that not impact the rest of the global economy?
That's certainly a more significant hit than what people were saying just a couple of weeks ago. Right. The presumptions were in the low fives at that point. What's interesting is the response by Xi Jinping has overwhelmingly been contain this virus no matter what, expand to large cities, take care of the media, and have control of political stability. And I think that if you do that, the economic implications clearly are going to be more negative. So I don't think there's a worry that Chinese political stability is going to be a problem, that there's going to be elite backlash against President Xi. But I absolutely believe that the economic hit on China will be larger than people have been expecting. And the question there, just in Munich last week, for example, and the Americans, Republicans and Democrats across the board were saying China is our principal national security concern. And the one person who hasn't been saying much of that in the last few weeks has been Trump, because he's focused on the phase one trade deal. He's focused on Xi Jinping is strong. He can get it done. The American economy is doing well. If this becomes a big enough deal the next couple of months, that it's not just about Chinese economy taking a big hit in the first quarter, but it's seen as actually affecting the American economy, seen as having a difference in how Trump considers his reelection campaign, he's going to switch. He's going to switch on China. And if that happens, there's no support underneath him for it, right? So the likelihood you move from just the tech Cold War, where we have this decoupling on 5G and Huawei and this big fight with the Europeans, for example, into something that feels much broader, something that actually takes the world's two largest economies and puts them more at political loggerheads. We're heading in that direction anyway, but that becomes a much more likely possibility in the run-up to the elections.
Joe pointed out earlier that we've had Scott Gottlieb and others who have come on and said they anticipate that there will be pockets of outbreak here in the United States. Now, that's not saying how big of the outbreak. That's not saying how many people. if that's the case, though, it's a different scenario. How would that potentially impact the U.S. economy and the U.S. stock markets?
I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to opine on that. But I will.
Are you an epidemiologist?
No, yeah. I'm not. I'm a political scientist, so I'm
right.
looking at how the politics of America and China and the rest fall. I mean, look, I was talking to the head of the WHO last week in Munich, and his perspective at that point still was, we don't believe that there's likely to be that kind of a significant breakout in other countries. What I do remember is after 9/11 in the United States,
shut down travel.
Right, shut down travel. And by the way, treatment of Saudi citizens coming into the U.S. was rather different than it had been pre-9/11. Imagine how Chinese citizens living in the U.S. as well as traveling to the U.S. might be treated if suddenly there was an actual fear of such a breakout.
Well, you've already seen Facebook and Sony say that they're not sending any employees to a conference that's being held in San Francisco, similarly in Boston. I mean, those are U.S. cities that we're now saying, forget it, we're not sending any of our employees to.
Well, a lot of these things, global companies that were planning on having global confabs in the United States and saying, well, we can't bring our Asian employees, so let's push it back. I was involved in one of those coming up next month. They already canceled it. So I think the fear factor and the uncertainty around what this is likely to look like in the coming weeks definitely is going to have a much bigger economic impact.
That's enough right now to cause an impact. And my only point is that with our economy, we're humming along pretty good here.
2% plus, yeah.
Right, but in other ways, right, with wages and things happening. And if there were pockets break out here, it wouldn't take much to see a little bit of an effect, which if people aren't going to movies, aren't going to restaurants, that if there were pockets here, I think we would. I just know human behavior, and we might stay home, and there would be some effect on our domestic economy, which we're not seeing now, except for uncertainty.
We're not seeing now.
Except for the uncertainty of the whole situation.
I think that's right, Joe. And my response to that is,
I'd like to know whether there's going to be anything here.
That level of uncertainty and fear in an election period where a big piece of Trump's popularity is precisely that the average American feels really good.
Right.
The likely response, in my view, is who am I blaming for this? I'm blaming China. And just let's take the macro point, too, which is China's 17% of the global economy. It's a huge piece of global growth. It also just doesn't have anywhere near the institutional resilience, anywhere near the leadership that the Americans or the Japanese or the French or the Germans. And so you're going to see more pandemic. You're going to see a lot more coal and a much bigger carbon footprint and export of said coal to other countries in terms of infrastructure. You're going to see less control, data sovereignty, and more concerns about people losing their identities. So the kinds of risks that we consider black swans in a world where China is going to be the largest economy just structurally goes up. The quality of your growth goes down.